Hello, and welcome to SETI Live. I'm your host, Beth Johnson, Communications Specialist here at the SETI Institute. Welcome to our viewers from around the world. Thank you for joining us. Please let us know where you are watching from. Also, welcome to listeners on the podcast version of SETI Live, available on most podcast platforms. We've got a fascinating topic today. We are once again returning to Mars. We're going to talk about Mars, some climate change, and the surprising role of a rare mineral called siderite. Joining me today is Dr. Ben Tutolo, an associate professor at the University of Calgary and a participating scientist on NASA's Curiosity rover team. Ben, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Beth.
So you and your colleagues made an exciting discovery, and it could help us sort of reshape our understanding of ancient Mars, how planetary climates evolve. But we should probably start with some background. So let's talk a little bit about Mars. It wasn't always this kind of like dry, cold, maybe even dead world that we see today. It had rivers, lakes, and a couple weeks ago we talked about how it had precipitation. So what happened? How did Mars lose its atmosphere, and how do we know?
Right, that's a good question. So probably the most important thing we know about Mars's climate is that in order to do all of those things, to stabilize liquid water, to have rivers, to have lakes, even potentially oceans, as some people hypothesize, it must have been warm enough. It must have been above about 0 degrees Celsius, which of course is the freezing point of water. To do that, it needs a lot of carbon dioxide in its atmosphere. And by a lot, I mean like way more than we would possibly be familiar with here on Earth. So we're talking about 1 bar or 1 atmosphere partial pressure of CO2, just to really even think about getting to a level where we have liquid water on the surface of Mars. And then as the climate modelers have shown, like even CO2 in the face of a faint young sun 4 billion years ago, even that level of CO2 is still probably not enough. So we have to do some other things. I won't really get into that today, but the ideas are that we need lots of CO2 to have a warm, habitable early Mars. And again, people have been looking for evidence for that for a long time, because the contrast is that today there's very little CO2 in the atmosphere. It's about 6 millibars. So the difference between that is 3 orders of magnitude, so 1,000 times. We really have to change the dynamics there. And there's measurements that are happening in the upper atmosphere of Mars that show us that CO2 is indeed leaking out into space. So we know that over the history of Mars, it has lost substantial CO2 to space. We have some ideas that it should be locked up in carbonate minerals, but until recently, until this study that we've put out, we didn't really know how much there was and whether that can make a dent in this global carbon accounting. And then there's CO2 in other places that have been lost. But in the end, we would have needed substantial, like 1,000 times more CO2 in order to do all the things that we know would have made early Mars habitable.
So this is sort of where geology kind of comes in, and this mineral siderite. And we've managed to put some rovers on Mars. Curiosity, one of the amazing things about it, it has this drill, it has an X-ray diffractor, it can analyze what the composition of the rocks and dirt are. So that's really neat. So let's talk about what Curiosity rover found. What did it find in Gale Crater, and what makes this find in your paper so significant? Tell us about siderite.
Yeah, so it found the mineral siderite, iron carbonate, in a place where we wouldn't have expected it. So we're, of course, exploring Mount Sharp, which is in Gale Crater. That's Curiosity's landing place, and its entire mission is climbing this mountain. And so because it is the place where one of our very few rovers on Mars have actually traveled, it has been studied in every way possible before we get there. So Mars has been mapped by satellites going over the planet that have given us information about topography. So that's how we knew the mountain was there to begin with, but then also the mineralogy of the rocks that are there. And so we have spectroscopic instruments on some of those satellites. And we knew that this place where Curiosity rover is, and has been for a couple of years now, was going to be interesting. We knew it was going to be interesting because it had lots of this sulfate salt, magnesium sulfate salt, that we know from experiments and understanding here on Earth is extremely soluble. So that's like Epsom salt that some folks will use in their baths. We know that you could basically dump in an entire container of that stuff and it will all just dissolve. And so the fact that it precipitated on Mars and is recorded in the rock record means that that's a record of the great drying of Mars, perhaps, in a very dry interval. And so we knew from the beginning of the mission that someday we were going to get to this place in Mount Sharp that has this salt in it. But when we got there, we also discovered that it contains this iron carbonate mineral with the formula FeCO3, which is known as citarite. And interestingly, it's got lots of citarite. So not just a little bit that you could have easily missed in the X-ray diffraction pattern, but on the order of 10.5% in the most enriched sample.
Oh, wow.
Is what we observed. And so it's there. It was there over 90 meters of stratigraphy as we published in the paper, and we're continuing to look for it above as well. And that is not at all apparent from the orbital mapping, which is perhaps one of the most surprising things.
So let's dig in a little bit more. It's an iron carbonate. That's what you're saying. So there's iron. There's the CO3 carbonate. Why is this particular mineral such a big deal when we're talking about the past? I understood where we were coming from with the magnesium sulfate, and how does this one work?
Yeah, so on Earth, our much more familiar carbonate mineral is calcite, calcium carbonate, so CaCO3. And the way Earth operates is CO2 goes into our atmosphere from volcanoes. That's volcanoes CO2, volcanically emitted CO2 dissolves into waters and then eventually goes into the rivers and the ocean and becomes limestone, calcium carbonate rocks. Mm-hmm. On Mars, it's the red planet. It's much more iron rich. We don't necessarily expect calcium carbonate to be the primary carbonate mineral, but rather iron carbonate or citarite. And so the reason iron carbonate is important is because it is capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and putting it down, putting a record of that CO2 down as rocks, but then also pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I mean, the reason it's forming it is specifically in this salty interval, this sulfate-bearing unit, we hypothesize is related to evaporation processes. So as you evaporate any solution, all of its ingredients get more enriched. We all know that if you leave a pot boiling on the stove for a long time, that you'll leave the salt crust at the bottom afterwards. We figure that something similar happened on ancient Mars to deposit this iron carbonate and magnesium sulfate salt in the same locations.
Okay, so this is all sort of suggesting, talking about this ancient kind of carbon cycle is this is what we're looking at. Can you explain what a carbon cycle is and why this would be significant?
Yeah, I think in general, probably we need to always base our understanding of other planets based on our own understanding of Earth. And I think, to me, one of the most remarkable things about Earth is that it has been habitable for around 4.5 billion years, or a little over 4 at least, but maybe its entire history. So shortly after it was formed, we have evidence for liquid water in the form of rain and oceans and so on existing really early on. And the reason it has never gotten too hot or too cold over its history is the carbon cycle. So more or less, carbon dioxide that comes out of our volcanoes has been balanced, at least until recently, to a great degree by geologic processes that put it down as limestone, which then gets subducted into Earth's mantle, and then the CO2 comes back out at the volcanoes. On Mars, we would have expected a very similar early Mars, right, where we have lots of volcanic emissions. The whole planet is covered in volcanic basaltic flows that came from volcanic eruptions. So part and parcel with that is the fact that CO2 is going to come out of the volcanoes into the atmosphere. We figure that you could have, had anywhere from about 1 to 10 bars of CO2 total equivalent come out of all the volcanoes on Mars based on what we understand about its rocks. So we have plenty of opportunity to get CO2 in the atmosphere and then warm the planet. And then the closure of the cycle on Mars is that CO2 dissolves in water. And as we predict using geochemical models, that as that CO2-rich water interacts with the salt, we should precipitate minerals like iron carbonate or citarite. The interesting thing is, although that's been predicted since at least 20, 30 years ago, it has been very hard. I think I would say curiously hard to find evidence that ever happened on Mars. So there's been, here and there discoveries of carbonate, but there's been very little actual evidence that we have enough carbonate to really reflect the fact that we would have had CO2 coming out of volcanoes and going back into rocks on Mars in the way that we have on Earth, as we would expect. So I think that's always been a bit of a mystery in the Martian history, is where the carbonates have been. And of course, now we find them, and they've actually probably been hiding in plain sight the whole time, it turns out.
So this really does suggest that Mars once had this much more massive amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that you said we would need in order to have liquid water on the surface. And now you're starting to find the evidence that it was drawn down and locked inside rocks. So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Yeah, so the evidence we have from Gale Crater, and then by extrapolation around the whole planet, and I can just briefly describe that in a second, is that there was a bunch of CO2 in the atmosphere and it's been drawn down. The reason we have faith in our extrapolation around the whole planet is that this same sequence of rocks, where you go from clay-rich rocks to sulfate-rich rocks, happens all over Mars. And there's sulfate-rich mounds all over Mars. They've been mapped from space. And as I said before, we can easily see the sulfates. We know that the sulfates are there. But what we didn't know until now is that there's also carbonates hiding in those rocks. So in our spectroscopic mapping of the planet, we knew that there was sulfate deposits around the planet. But based on our understanding on the ground using X-ray diffraction with the Chemin instrument on Curiosity, we believe that all of those sulfates could also contain citarite, in which case there's abundant carbonates or abundant CO2 locked up as carbonates in these sulfate-rich mounds.
So I'm kind of curious here. There's a lot of curious in this Curiosity data. This kind of sounds like what we're trying to do here on Earth, right? You mentioned that this is a thing that we know happens here on Earth. We have a carbon cycle here, and we want to sequester carbon in the rocks in order to sort of mitigate some of the climate issues that we are having because we have so much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at this point. Are there parallels between these two, these two planets that we can point out and say like, ooh, this is something that could happen, or here's how we can fix it?
Yeah, so great question. So I mean, I think as a direct analog, I started my career actually working on climate change solutions, like capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and sequestering it as a way of mitigating climate change here on Earth. So I guess my expertise in understanding carbonates on Mars comes from the fact that I've been studying that as a climate change solution here on Earth. And so what we can learn from Mars is actually very unique and actually very helpful, right? So we always on Earth, we always wonder, can we control for all of the variables in any particular experiment or in any natural laboratory or weathering setting that we're looking at? And on Mars, although we have other issues where we only have a handful of instruments that we're able to make measurements with, we are able to say pretty clearly that there's no clear evidence that biological processes are contributing to the precipitation of these minerals. We are able to say, like, this is what happens in the event that basalts, which are rich in these iron and calcium and magnesium-rich minerals, interact with CO2-rich waters and precipitate carbonates. We're able to look at that, and we're able to see how that stuff is preserved over geologic timescales, right? The rocks that we're looking at in Gale Crater are about 3.5 billion years old. On Earth, it probably would be unlikely to last that long because we do have plate tectonics, we do have subduction. But the evidence is that once the carbonates are captured, they have a hard time ever being dissolved back into CO2 or into or re-entering the atmosphere as CO2. And as a result, we can have some confidence that if we're capturing CO2 for climate change solutions here on Earth, that it's going to stay there.
So does this help us understand or better understand Earth's long-term climate future? Does this give us hope?
Well, I guess what I will say is, going back to what I said before about Earth's long-term carbon cycle being the reason that the planet has been habitable for the last 4 billion years or so, is to me impressive. It means that the global scale processes can work together in sort of a harmonious fashion to lead to more or less stable temperatures that are fairly comfortable to most life on Earth. Of course, there's been extinctions, there's been snowballers and stuff like that. But in general, it has remained habitable. On Mars, like learning about how Mars actually lost its atmosphere and much of that ended up in rocks, we're learning that, actually this fine balance between CO2 in and CO2 out from the atmosphere is extremely delicate, right? That actually, if you just tip a little bit too far in one direction, you can become Mars and cold and dry, and the other direction you become Venus, super hot, melt wet at the surface of the planet. So that actually, I think one of the most impressive things about any planet is that actually very little of its total endowment of carbon is actually stored in its atmosphere, right? That's a very small pool, and that you actually have enormous fluxes in and out that in the end have to balance that very small pool. So the small perturbations in how much goes in or how much comes out can actually create huge issues in terms of the climate of the planet, which is what's happening to us now, right? Over the last couple hundred years, we've started injecting tons of CO2 in our atmosphere in a way that the Earth can't keep up, and that's how we're warming so quickly.
So I want to ask you some more things, but really quickly, if you have questions for Ben, please put those in the comments. We are reading them, and we will select some to answer in a few minutes. Ben, how does this, you kind of touched on it a little, but I want to touch on it a little bit more. How does this sort of discovery change how we think about where to search for life, or what the possibility could have been even on Mars for past life?
Yeah, so I think let's start with the second question, then go back to where we should look beyond. So the second question, in terms of where we should look for life on ancient Mars, it's clear from all of this accumulating evidence that we have this a period of Martian history where there's liquid water flowing, there's rivers, there's lakes, there's maybe even potentially oceans, but there's warm temperatures, right? And so if we're going to look at rocks from Mars and potentially return them like the plan for the Perseverance rover has been, then we should be looking at this interval or even older, right? So I think that post this interval, whenever we are seeing this great drying, all these salty waters, in some ways it might be the last best chance for life. So another member of the Curiosity rover team, William Rapin, has a paper from a couple of years ago thinking about wetting and drying cycles and how important that is for the origins of life, at least the way that we believe that the chemical synthesis reactions may have worked. So I think that this, interestingly, might be a very good time in terms of searching for first Martian life forms. And then going to beyond our solar system, going to exoplanets and so on. I think what this is telling us is that really this, I mean, there's two or three main factors, one being how bright the star is, right? The other being the distance, and then the atmospheric composition. What this is telling us is that, like, even though Mars is sort of, I would say, it seems like it's too far away to be habitable, but at least during parts of its history, it was habitable. And so we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater if a planet doesn't necessarily seem to be in exactly what we would define as the terrestrial habitable zone. That many factors, including having this significant CO2 atmosphere and then all of those other processes that might have contributed to early Martian warming, can take place. And so they are potential places where life may exist.
I think it's really funny how we've tried to move away from the term Goldilocks zone when we talk about where to search for habitable worlds. But if you look at our own solar system, and as you said, you have Mars on one side and Venus on the other, and literally it really does kind of feel like there is sort of that almost Goldilocks planet in the middle. It's just sort of amazing that, like, we try to get away from an initial idea, and yet we're still here with it. So I'm going to welcome in people. We have people watching from pretty much around the world here. This is pretty amazing. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Michigan, Louisiana, Ohio, Vancouver Island in Canada, Belgium, bonjour, Romania, New Jersey, Ontario, other side of Canada, well, middle of Canada, Sao Paulo. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Again, if you have questions for Ben, please put those in the chat. I'm going to kind of dig in a little bit to the instrumentation. So can we talk a little bit about how Curiosity got the data and what was done to analyze it? You can kind of get into the weeds a little bit here. What sort of instrumentation does Curiosity use for this?
Yeah. So Curiosity rover is like truly an amazing piece of equipment. I mean, I think it's in some ways showing its age, but in many ways is not at all showing its age. So it is. It's been on the planet for about a dozen years now, give or take, and it has a couple of things that are really useful for the type of study that we put out here. So the first and most important thing is cameras. Right? So the mass camera enables us to take pictures, including in panoramic mosaic mode, so that we can actually see really beautiful reconstruction. So our paper did get the cover of Science in the issue that it was in, and that picture that's on the cover was taken by the mass cams on Curiosity rover. And again, you get these beautiful, like, super visceral images of the things you're looking at. So it almost feels like you're truly there. So that most important thing is seeing what we're looking at. And then second is, as reconnaissance, we use this instrument known as the chemistry and camera instrument, which is a laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy, or a LIBS instrument. And what it's doing is vaporizing effectively, turning rocks into plasma using its laser, taking a picture. And with that, we can say something about the chemistry of the rocks that we're looking at. And the really useful thing about ChemCam is that it doesn't need to be unstowed or anything. It's just always at the top of the rover. So we can shoot this laser as we drive and then get an idea of how the chemistry of rocks is changing as we drive, which again, in this case, is very important because we did change from different, more clay-rich rocks down below to these sulfate-rich rocks that we're examining here. Another complementary instrument is the APXS instrument, which we use, again, for reconnaissance data collection, but it does take contact science. It does take unstowing it in order to have it near the samples that we're examining. And then, I guess most importantly for this study is the CheMin instrument. So CheMin is short for chemistry and mineralogy. And CheMin is the only X-ray diffraction instrument that has ever flown on another planet, or ever been operated on another planet. And it has been at the heart of an extraordinary number of discoveries from the Curiosity rover. And it really is at the heart of this discovery as well. So the way CheMin works is we drill a sample using Curiosity's drill. It brings that sample up above the belly of the rover, sort of rotates it backwards in order to sprinkle the drill tailings into the rover. And then it ends up in a cell. And that cell is basically X-ray transparent. So we can have X-rays go right through that cell. And then, unlike most X-ray diffraction instruments here on Earth, the CheMin instrument is a transmission geometry instrument. So what that means is that we have our sample like this. The X-rays go straight through the sample, come out the other side, and we collect them on a two-dimensional detector. And that two-dimensional detector is aligned such that whenever the X-rays are diffracted, or they hit lattice planes in the minerals in our sample, the X-rays move out from the center. So it sort of is creating circular patterns on our two-dimensional detector. And with those circular patterns, we're able to do X-ray diffraction-based mineralogy. With that mineralogy, we can fit the patterns to say how much of each mineral is in the sample, but then also uniquely using a technique known as Rietveld refinement, we can also say the chemistry of the minerals themselves. So not only can we say what the minerals are, but then we could say how much, for example, magnesium is in our iron-rich siderite. And using that, we were able to show that the siderite is on the order of 5 to 10% in all of these samples, and that the siderite in every of the sample that we investigated here is extremely pure. So between 95 and 100% iron carbonate.
Wow. I was somewhat familiar with CheMin, but having it explained like that is incredibly helpful. Thank you so much. I mean, I've actually seen one, like a small one in operation, but I don't think it was ever explained quite as well as that. That was really cool. So what are some of what's kind of coming up for you then? What's next in this?
So as I guess everyone should know, Curiosity is still very active. We just had a meeting earlier today about potentially investigating some new rocks on the planet. So as we hypothesize in our paper, if this is all sort of a internally consistent process where we're making magnesium sulfates, we're making iron carbonates, we're making also calcium sulfates, which I did not really talk about. If we're making them all from the same fluid, and all of this stuff that's been mapped from space is magnesium sulfate rich, and we should expect to continue to see siderite as we go up. And increasingly, we are confident that those predictions are correct. So there's some newer data that you can find on the planetary data system repository that indicates that there is siderite continuing in these samples. And then also we can certainly talk about future projections into what else we're going to look at. So the above where we're at right now is these structures known as the boxworks. So the boxworks are clear indications that fluid flow happened in Gale Crater a long time ago. So they're, if you look at them from the top, they look like boxworks. They look like a mesh pattern that's been formed through water-rock interaction in the past. So in the very near future, we're going to be able to investigate those, including with the ChemIn instrument. And then further up, there's a structure that if you go even onto the Curiosity, where is Curiosity map, you can see these structures known as the yardangs, which are these wind-blown structures. And to me, you can't really even look at those and have anything but curiosity about what they are, like what caused them, what are they made out of. And so in, again, the not too distant future, so we're about to enter into extended mission 5 of the Curiosity rover mission. And 2 of the things we plan to investigate during EM5 are the boxworks and the yardangs. And hopefully those will continue to surprise us in the way that these samples have.
That's incredibly exciting, and I'm definitely going to look forward to more of the results from this Curiosity, just continuing to knock it out of the park. I do have a viewer question. We'll go for it. Let's just go for this. So it's a question from Melvin in the UK. What might we learn from these findings in terms of possible future terraforming of Mars, or how to make sure Earth doesn't suffer a similar fate? So again, coming back to that, how do we prevent our own climate change issues from this work?
Yeah, so what we can say, I mean, there's a couple of things we can learn. One is that these rocks, because they were deposited so long ago and the sun was much less bright than it is today, that at that time it would have taken even more carbon dioxide to make the planet warm. So if we're going to terraform Mars, if we're going to do something to make the planet trap heat better today, we do have some lessons about what type of atmospheric composition that are required to actually get the planet above freezing. And a co-author on this paper, Edwin Kite, has been thinking about that, and you can read some of his recent papers as well, thinking about ways of doing this with particles, perhaps instead of CO2. So there's a lot there. One interesting thing is that these salts, these magnesium sulfate salts, are all hydrated. So in principle, you could develop techniques or strategies of turning those magnesium sulfates into liquid water, which then could potentially help people to habitate the planet if that's something that is desired. But then at the end there, like, how do we make sure Earth doesn't suffer a similar fate? I think the lessons are, again, coming back to what I said earlier, that habitability is a very fragile concept, right? On Earth, it has seemed robust over our 4 billion years of history, but Mars and Venus, for that matter, too. But really, if you think about Mars, is a true example that like habitability can be ephemeral, right? That it can be in existence. It can happen for quite a while, 3.5 billion years. So that's 1 billion years after Mars formed. That's a significant chunk of time in order to have liquid water and the potential for life on ancient Mars. But then after 3.5 billion years, there's little evidence that there's much of this, if any, happening, any liquid water flowing in rivers. And so that demonstrates that you can lose this thing that we require, which is the habitable conditions. And I think in terms of Earth, we're risking that, right? We're doing things to our atmosphere faster than the Earth can keep up, and as a result, our habitability is slipping away.
I think it's interesting how interconnected so many of my interviews have become of late. So talking about origins of life, windows of habitability, and what's gone on Mars, and how that relates to what's going on here on Earth. It all just ties together in the most amazing ways. And so I'm always deeply appreciative to all of the scientists who are working on these problems, both here and on other worlds, because they all do tie together. So thank you, Ben, for that. This has been really insightful, and I am deeply appreciative of you taking the time to come and chat with us. And thank you, of course, to the audience for tuning in. So I do have to welcome someone who came in from Virginia. So more states to call viewers today. So Ben, thank you for sharing your time and your insights with us today. To our viewers, if you'd like to learn more about the discovery, the link to the press release and the paper is in our description. So if you are on one of the platforms that gives you the full description, great, you can go click on those links down there. If you are not, then please head over to our YouTube and you can get those links on our YouTube version. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like it, share it with your fellow space nerds, subscribe for more space science interviews like this one. And next week, Frank Marchis will be back and talking with another researcher about Earth's technosphere and possible future scenarios for our world. So make sure you tune in for that. And hopefully we will have Ben back again, because it sounds like Curiosity is still doing amazing things that we will want to talk about. And as always, as a reminder, we are a 501c3 nonprofit. So if you would like to support the SETI Institute and our outreach programs like this, you can go to seti.org and click on the donate or give now button and make a small contribution. Your bits, your subs, your super chats, your stars, all of those things also support this program. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter, Journey, which comes out on a weekly and monthly basis to stay abreast of all of the amazing science news coming out and to get lists of all of our SETI Lives that we have out. And don't forget to look for our SETI Live podcast. And until next time, keep looking up, everybody, and stay curious.